One of the worst feelings in chess is when you fall for an opening trap that your opponent has prepared before the game. You find yourself in a bad or even losing position before you have time to get your pieces developed and start playing chess. Let's take a look at some of the most common opening traps you can use to gain a quick advantage against unprepared opponents, as well as learn how to avoid falling into traps yourself. Sometimes, a player decides to defend by copying the opponent's moves. The player thinks if a move is good enough for one side, it should be good enough for the other side. Is that true? Let's take a look. After e4, e5, knight f3, and knight f6, white plays knight takes e5. Both sides have been playing the same moves. Now if black plays d6 before capturing the pawn on e4, this is known as the main line of the Petrov defense, or Russian game, with a solid position for black. If black is only copying, then black will jump into the center immediately with knight takes e4. Black is now in trouble as the e-file has been cleared of pawns, so white can play queen to e2, attacking black's knight. The copycat strategy fails after queen e7 and queen takes e4. Unless black wants to take the copying strategy to the extreme and lose a queen after queen takes e5, black's only way to stay in the game is to play d6, attacking white's knight, which is pinned to the queen. White can simply play d4, and after d takes e5 and d takes e5, white is simply up a pawn with a better position. If black tries to avoid going down a pawn, black may try d5, protecting the knight. After d3, black is on the edge of disaster. If black retreats the knight, say with knight f6, white can win black's queen by force. Can you see how? That's right, with knight to c6, discovering the queen's check against black's king and attacking the black queen. Notice that if the black queen tries to block the check with queen e7, white still wins the queen with knight takes e7. After d3, black's best try is queen to e7, counterattacking white's knight. After d takes e4 and queen takes e5, white still wins a pawn after e takes d5. Notice that black's queen cannot capture the pawn on d5 because it is pinned to the king. This is why copying your opponent is not a good idea. Let's take a look at another opening trap. After e4, c6, black plays the Caro-Kann defense, and after the typical moves d4, d5, knight to c3, and d takes e4, white recaptures knight takes e4, and black plays knight to d7. Black's idea is to support knight g to f6, so that if white tries to capture that knight, black is prepared to recapture with another knight. White plays the strange-looking queen e2. This is not a great move as it blocks in the light-squared bishop, but it does set up a deadly trap. If black develops without understanding the point behind white's last move and plays knight g to f6, white can actually win the game in one move. Do you see it? That's right, knight to d6. It's a smothered mate. White's queen is pinning the pawn to the king, and all of black's pieces smother the black king so it cannot escape. What should black have done instead? Black can simply play e6, opening up the dark-squared bishop and preventing any chance of a smothered mate. Now white's queen on e2 looks misplaced, which is why opening traps that only hope your opponent doesn't find the best move should not be played. One thing to remember is to only play an opening trap when it improves your position, even if your opponent doesn't fall for the trap. Otherwise, you are just playing hope chess. Let's take a look at a trap in the Queen's Gambit declined. After d4, d5, c4, and e6, the Queen's Gambit declined after the typical moves knight to c3, knight to f6, and bishop to g5. White pins black's knight. Black usually plays bishop to e7 in order to unpin the knight, but sometimes black plays the tricky knight b to d7, setting up a trap. Notice that the black queen is no longer protecting d5 now that there's a knight in the way. So white thinks a pawn can be won by taking advantage of black's pin knight on f6. After c takes d5, e takes d5, white should now play e3 or knight to f3. But it looks like white can just win a pawn with knight takes d5, because the f6 knight looks like it's pinned to the queen. Well, it is pinned to the queen, but that doesn't stop black from playing the surprising knight takes d5. After bishop takes d8, notice that white's king only has one square available, d2. Do you see black's idea? That's right, after bishop b4 check, white is forced to block the check with the queen. And after bishop takes d2 and king takes d2, black plays king takes d8. Notice that black has won a knight for a pawn. In the queen's gambit, it's important to know that it's not really a gambit being an opening in which one side sacrifices a pawn or more material for an attack, because after d takes c4, although the most aggressive move is e4, grabbing more space in the center and threatening to recapture the pawn on c4, sometimes white prefers e3. Black's best idea is to focus on developing the kingside pieces and castling. Sometimes, black is tempted to hold on to the c4 pawn with b5. Black is in for a surprise. After a4, white attacks the defender of the c4 pawn, b5. And after c6, white can play a takes b5. And after c takes b5, notice that now that the pawn is no longer on c6, the h1 to a8 diagonal has been opened. Can you find a way for white to take advantage of these weak light squares and win a piece? That's right, queen to f3. White threatens to win the rook on a8. Black's best defense is to give up a knight for free after knight c6. So after queen takes c6 check, black can play bishop to d7, attacking the white queen and revealing the black queen's protection of the a8 rook. White is up an entire piece, so this shows the risk of trying to hold on to the c4 pawn in the queen's gambit. Now it's your turn to practice setting up as well as avoiding opening traps.